Okay. The second book we will be discussing is Crying in H-Mart by Michelle Zauner, which is actually a memoir. So this memoir is an evocative, emotional exploration of grief, identity, and the complex relationship between culture and family. We're going to be looking at how Zauner's story can be analyzed through the lens of cultural continuance, a concept that refers to the ways in which cultural practices, traditions, and values are maintained, adapted, or even transformed through generations. In this book in particular, this idea of how culture is lost or displaced when faced with the loss of a loved one, especially considering what goes on in the book. So before we dive in, let's just set the stage. Crying in H-Mart is a larger reflection of the intersections between family, food, and identity. Zauner's mother, Chong-mi, passes away from cancer as Zauner's in her 20s. This memoir centers on her mourning process, interwoven with her efforts to hold on to her Korean heritage in the face of profound grief. So what does cultural continuance mean in the context of the memoir? Let's take a look. Okay, so the first point that we're going to be talking about is how losing Michelle's mother is a way of how she sort of lost her culture in a way. So many people's identities are tied to their families, and in Zauner's case, her mother was the keeper of their Korean culture. Chong-mi, her mother, was not only represented through the cultural traditions. I'm sorry. Let me just start that sentence over. Chong-mi, her mother, not only represented the cultural traditions of Korea, but she also embodied the connection to that culture through language, food, and daily practices. After her death, Zauner is confronted with the loss of a living connection to her cultural heritage. One of the few tangible ways to hold on to her mother and the culture she left behind was particularly Korean food.
You know, that reminds me of the idea where mothers are often seen as keepers of the culture and traditions. Like, remember back to Greengrass Running Waters? They take hold of the invisible labor of passing down these traditions, and because of that, they tend to be the primary caretakers.
Yeah, I agree with this. So I know that mothers, they fall into like the caregiving like responsibilities, and it is their biological role, which is like to nurture. But even with the evolution of science, many mothers still conform to this role. I noticed, and these traditional gender roles stem from cultural values. And as we look at Asian societies, some Asian mothers are deeply rooted in these values, such as familial duty, respect for elders, where women should prioritize their children and family over personal ambitions. And understanding these reinforced roles by society allows us to acknowledge the pressure they face and the expectations placed on them. This awareness also allows us to see the generational trauma that can stem from the pressure on mothers to uphold traditional caregiving roles. And at the expenses of their mental health, these mothers pass their beliefs and coping mechanisms onto their children.
And in the memoir, Zauner reflects with food, and I just wanted to kind of take that and consider the quote, when I'm eating Korean food, I'm eating the things that my mom made, that my grandma made, that my ancestors made. And so in a way, it's like I'm trying to eat my way back into my identity. I feel like this can really tie in with what you just said, Stephanie, about mothers and their roles. It also just goes to show that even in the face of loss, Honor attempts to keep her heritage alive through these foods, and that in the way that her mother prepared them. Also through the rituals of cooking and through the memories of their shared family meals. So it's not just about nostalgia. I feel like it's deeper than that. It's kind of like a way to show like a continual legacy.
You know, and yeah, it's even harder to preserve that culture legacy if your mother tongue is buried there, which happens to Zauner in the book. She doesn't have that much of her native language with her. Losing your language is definitely affects how much your ancestry can be preserved, and food is definitely one way to feel that connection. So while one line of continuity has been lost, there are plenty others to help keep the heritage alive for future generations.
Yes, so in my household, just to like relate to what you just said, in my household, cultural food like that's been passed down around generations from within the inner workings of my family can be seen like everywhere, whether it's pho or it's egg rolls or it's spring rolls or it's just soup. There's always something laying around to eat. Similar to Zauner, I feel as though food isn't just something that we just like eat or we just consume. It's an endless line of culture that's transferred from one generation to the next, and it's just kind of representative of the history of our ancestors.
Yeah, so relating to what you guys just said, I know that food is deeply honored, especially in culture, as it can be seen as a symbol for love, respect, and connection. The way we prepare and share food can nurture our relationships and celebrate traditions, with each dish carrying special significance, especially with spiritual connection. The powerful connection food has on our memories stems from our brain. When we encounter familial flavors and scents, the brain recalls past experiences, evoking memories of people, places, and significant events. The act of cooking not only engages with these sensory pathways, but also reinforces cultural and familial bonds, shaping our identities and connections to tradition.
Okay. We've already been talking about food, but now our second point that we want to be talking about is how food is like connected to cultural continuance and its role, basically. So in this memoir, food acts as a living bridge between past and present. Zauner's depictions and descriptions of her mother's cooking are full of vivid detail, whether that's the smell of kimchi or the taste of stew, or just the way her mother's hands moved in the kitchen. Food also represented something deeper than that, though. It was sort of a means of keeping her mother's spirit alive. It was a metaphor as to how culture can survive even when those who practice it are gone. Through Zauner's experiences and story, we see a powerful example of how culture endures through ritual. Acts of cooking and sharing meals become an anchor in a turbulent sea of loss. For Zauner, these rituals offer sort of like a form of resistance to the erasure of her mom's identity and, by extension, her own. Utilizing the cultural continuance lens, it can be clearly seen that food is more than just a sustenance. It's a living memory, a space for ritual, and a way of claiming back identity. Zauner's reflections on food recognize that culture is often preserved not in grand ceremonies or festivals, but in the daily practices that may seem ordinary. For example, Zauner states from her memoir that I didn't realize how much I depended on her cooking to define my identity until I was suddenly in a world where I had to recreate it for myself. This is an important moment in the book, highlighting how cultural practices are handed down through generations. Zauner's learning curve in the kitchen after her mother's passing shows a broader reality. That cultural continuity often requires a form of active participation. It's not something that can be passively inherited. It must be practiced, embodied, and sustained. Even through loss, this act of cultural continuance can be seen in Zauner's efforts to recreate her mother's cultural dishes even after her passing. Okay, that was our second point. So moving from second to third, the diasporic experience and cultural continuance is what we want to be talking about. So Crying in H-Mart embarks on the exploration of the Korean American experience. Zauner's experience growing up as a mixed race individual with a white father and a Korean mother means she navigates both worlds. She describes the challenges of fitting in with either side of her heritage, as she often feels disconnected from being both Korean and American and the communities that come with being that.
Relating as a multiracial woman, I often felt disconnected from my Asian roots. Classmates would tell me I wasn't Asian enough because of the way I looked. But at home, I experienced the struggles of my Asian immigrant mother, her high expectations, her sacrifices, her internalized social expectations, and her deep connection to her traditions. I was rooted in these traditions, which mainly consisted of food, as that was the only positive reminder of my mother's homeland. I spent weekends shopping in the only Indonesian town in California, West Covina. Despite these businesses shutting down today, the familiar sights and smells of my heritage grounded me. The distinct flavors, scents, and language allowed me to gain my mother's past of Indonesia. These experiences are a constant reminder of where I came from, allowing me to realize that I do belong and I have a say in my identity.
This scattering experience complicates the process of cultural continuity. Zauner's mother, being an immigrant, held on to traditional Korean practices as a way of keeping her heritage alive in an unfamiliar country. But Zauner, as a child of that immigrant experience, finds herself caught between two worlds, neither fully fitting into the American mainstream nor fully accepted within the Korean community. Zauner's journey to understand her cultural heritage becomes an act of reclaiming and redefining what it means to be Korean American. It's an ongoing process of negotiation where cultural continuity is not just about preserving the past, but also about adapting those traditions to the realities of the present. In reference to the memoir, there's a quote, "The Korean language has always felt foreign to me, but the more I understood the taste of the food, the more I understood the language of my mother's love." This quote speaks to the core of cultural continuity, the ways in which food, language, and love intertwine to form a bridge between generations. Even when the language feels foreign, the act of engaging with cultural practices like cooking becomes a way to reclaim and sustain that cultural bond. It's kind of like a way to reconnect with your ancestors. So the final point that we're going to be talking about in this episode is the emotional work of cultural continuance. Crying in H-Mart is about a lot of things, but it's also about the emotional labor involved in maintaining cultural continuity. As Michelle reflects on her mother's passing, she realizes that part of what she's mourning is the threat of her culture being lost to time. The memoir is ultimately about resilience. Zauner, through her music, writing, and her culinary practices, keeps her mother's memory and the culture alive. She's not just recalling the past, she's actively making space for it in her present. She reflects on this idea of remembering what came before and also thinking about what comes next while keeping her Korean culture alive. A quote that I pulled from the book that sort of reminded me of how she's always still thinking about her ancestors and her mom and her future all at the same time was on page 224. So I could pass it on someday. The lessons she imparted, the proof of her life lived on in me in my every move and deed. I was what she left behind. If I could not be with my mother, I would be her. I just feel like it was towards kind of like the end of the book, so I feel like it gave a really good kind of closure. It also just really connected her to her and her mom and just how she's always going to hold on to her mom. Continuing on. So Crying in H-Mart is a memoir about many things, grief, identity, and the complex relationships we have with family and heritage. But through the lens of cultural continuance, it becomes a powerful meditation on how culture is passed down, not just through bloodlines, but through the shared rituals that sustain it. Zauner's story is a testament to the resilience of cultural practices and a reminder that even in the face of loss, there are ways to ensure that our stories, our traditions, and our connections endure. This is Mother's Foresight, and thank you for listening to us today. Don't forget to give us a review if you liked it, and we hope this makes you want to watch your mom a little closer.